Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second session of the day for the Brass Spring 2026 Online Symposium. I'm Nora McKenzie, Chair of the Brass Reference and Academic Libraries Subcommittee or Committee for Brass, and also the co-chair of the Symposium Subcommittee alongside Kelly LaVoice. We also have a fantastic subcommittee that supports all of the work of making the symposium happen, and that includes Christy Cunningham, Kate Cummings, Brian Garrison-Wynn, and Doris Jui. All of our sessions today are being recorded, and those will be sent out along with the slides afterwards to everyone who registered. If you haven't already, please go ahead and mute your audio and video as we get started. So thank you again for spending time with Brass today and all of our presenters. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Kate to introduce our next presenter.
Hello, everyone. So our next presenter is Madison Veeneman. She is from Indiana University, and she will be presenting Encouraging Persistence in Business Students, Lessons Learned from Comparing Two Approaches to Database Instruction in One-Shots. We do ask if you could to save your questions until the end, and then I'm going to hand it over to Madison.
All right. Thank you. Let me get my slides pulled up. All right. So I'm assuming everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I've been attending Brass events for a while now and learning a lot from you all. So I'm happy to be here today to share what I've been working on. So I want to share my slides. So I want to share a quick outline of what this session will cover today. I'll give some brief background and then introduce the pedagogical approaches that I'll be focusing on today. And then I'll have a quick share out in a Padlet. And then I'll dive into discussing my instruction sessions this semester. So my lesson plans and some successes and challenges. And then I'll close by sharing some of my next steps and suggestions for your own instruction. And then I have a brainstorming activity, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And the learning outcomes for this session are to understand cognitivist and constructivist approaches to one-shot instruction, to compare the strengths and limitations of each of these approaches in encouraging persistence in business students, and then to brainstorm ideas for experimenting with instructional approaches in one-shots. So just a little bit of background. I am the liaison to the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and I've been in this position since July 2025. And a little bit of context about my institution. The business school here has around 1,200 undergraduates and 340 graduate students. And the course that I'll be talking about today is I-Core, or Integrated Core, and this is the junior year capstone course. So each section of this course works with a local company, and students work in groups to come up with an idea for a new product or service that the company could provide. And they complete 3 main assignments that cover the marketing, financial, and operations aspects involved in implementing their project. And this is likely the first research-intensive course that students are taking. There are 2 sections of this course in the spring and 5 sections in the fall, and I teach a one-shot for each section. And these are courses of around 50 to 60 students, which means they end up working in around 10 small groups. All right, so I taught one-shots for I-Core for the first time in the fall semester, and the previous business librarian had very generously shared her instructional materials with me, so I used this existing lesson plan last semester. And this was a 75-minute session that covered keyword brainstorming, how to find and use NAICS codes, and then it included 3 database demos of IBISWorld, Mintel, and Reference Solutions. And then it had time for students to practice searching. And these databases were relevant to cover because for the first assignment, students had to conduct an environmental scan, SWOT analysis, and market analysis for their project. And after the instruction sessions, I heard from some students who had questions about how to get started with research, where to find industry and consumer information. Some of them said they couldn't find anything. And so when I answered them, I was talking about the same topics and databases I had covered in the session. And of course, I was happy to answer those questions. And I know students don't retain everything you teach, but this got me thinking about whether I should try something different with my instruction. I wanted to focus more on how to encourage students to be persistent and willing to explore different resources rather than give up or get frustrated when they get stuck. Also, I knew that throughout the semester, students would need to use more resources than I had time to cover in one session. So ideally, my instruction could help them develop searching skills and an attitude of persistence that they could then apply across databases. So in other words, I wanted to focus on the ACRL frame of searching as strategic exploration. And one relevant knowledge practice from this frame is that students should know how to design and refine needs and search strategies as necessary based on search results. And then I was also interested in the dispositions in this frame because I'm interested in fostering those dispositions and not just concrete skills. And so a couple of those are that students should understand that first attempts at searching do not always produce adequate results, and that students should know how to persist in the face of search challenges. And then this also ties into the RUSA business research competencies. For example, one goal in that document is for students to understand that sources and content in the business information environment can be formatted or presented in a way that adversely impacts discovery, access, and usage. And persistence is required to successfully engage with the steps of the research process that the competencies document details. For example, when you're determining where information about a business topic can be found, and if it even exists, how to adjust a search strategy or a project topic based on the results you're seeing, and of course, when navigating the various business database interfaces. And in addition to meeting these learning outcomes, I also wanted my instruction to be informed by pedagogical theory. So I went back to the approaches I had learned about in my library science program, and I reviewed the literature for examples of how these approaches are applied. And the two approaches I'll be covering today are cognitivism and constructivism. So cognitivism focuses on how students understand, process, and retain knowledge, and argues that students learn by integrating new knowledge into their existing schema or their understanding of a topic. And self-assessment is an important piece of the learning process. And this theory is often applied using the cognitive apprenticeship model, which you can see in this chart here. And this begins by modeling, where an instructor demonstrates a skill or introduces a topic, and then coaching, where the instructor guides the students as they practice, scaffolding, where students continue to learn and practice more independently, articulation, where students explain their understanding, reflection, where they reflect on what they've learned, and then finally exploration, where they come up with goals for their future learning. Constructivism argues that learners construct their own understanding of a topic by engaging in active learning and reflection. And social constructivism further argues that engagement with peers is a necessary aspect of the learning process. And so a constructivist lesson plan might follow the steps in this chart, where you begin by engaging student interest, and then let students explore the topic and build their own understandings, including by working with their peers. And then you have students communicate what they've learned. And this is where you can also explain or clarify topics as necessary. And then have students apply what they've learned in a new setting. And then finally assess their learning. And just a couple of notes about pedagogy before I move on. First, these models show the ideal form of applying these theories, but in practice, instruction may not follow every step, and my own sessions were more truncated than this. And second, I think we can gravitate towards instructional approaches that we're familiar with or that worked for us as students or that we're the most comfortable with. And it's also easy to focus more on what we are teaching, the content, versus how we are teaching it. So I think this is why it's useful to learn about multiple theories and be willing to experiment with different methods in our teaching so that we can determine what is actually the most effective for our students. And that answer may differ depending on your context. All right, so at this point, I want to pause and give you all a chance to share what instructional approaches you use. So there will be a link in the chat to a Padlet, and the Padlet has a quick poll because I'm curious if folks are using one of these theories more than the other. And then if you use other approaches or there's details about an activity that you use that you'd like to share, you can also put a comment in the Padlet. So I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to add to that. It looks like some votes are coming in. Okay, interesting. It's starting to even out more now. Yeah, okay. So thank you for everyone who's putting in some comments. So some think, pair, share, that's a great activity. Accidentally using a mixture of these. Yes, I think a lot of us are doing that. Behaviorism, yes, that's another one of the kind of main learning theories. And so it looks like we have some folks who use one or the other, but majority seem to be using both, either in a combination or maybe different approaches in different sessions. So great. Thank you all for sharing. Let me go back to my slides. Okay. Oh, sorry, I think I just accidentally closed out. Try again. I closed the wrong window. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. All right, so thank you for engaging in that activity with me. So now I want to share what I did this semester. So I taught one section of the I-Core course with a cognitivist lesson plan and the other section with a constructivist lesson plan. So in the cognitivist approach, when I was teaching about the databases, I used an I do, you do activity that incorporated the modeling and coaching aspects of the cognitive apprenticeship model. And so I demonstrated a sample search in the database and then had students search for their own topic. And I also added a reflection at the end of the session to encompass the articulation and reflection steps of the model. And so this reflection asked students to answer what was the most important thing you learned today, how can you apply what you learned towards the next steps for your assignment, and what is something you still have a question about. So the benefit of this approach is that it provides structure and gives students confidence to replicate what they saw me model. And this aligns well with database instruction. A limitation of the cognitive apprenticeship model is I think it can lead to a narrow focus on how to use one particular database rather than learning general searching skills and dispositions that can apply to other contexts. For the constructivist approach, I used a jigsaw. So this is an activity for active learning and peer-to-peer teaching. So like I mentioned, students were working in small groups for this course. And so what I asked them to do was have half of their group explore IBIS World and the other half explore Mintel. And I had students take a few minutes to search on their own and then talk with the group members who looked at the same database and have them compare notes. And then I asked the whole group to teach each other about the databases they looked at. And then after that, we had a debrief and a discussion as a whole class. And I also gave them a paper worksheet with some questions to help kind of guide this activity. So what search features are you using and finding most helpful? What is difficult or confusing about searching in this database? What are you learning about your topic that could inform or alter your search? And then what advice would you give your classmates on how to use this database? I wanted this worksheet to kind of provide some structure and prompt them to reflect on their searching process and think about how they could explain their learning to others. The benefit of this approach is that it encourages independent exploration and learning from peers. One limitation is, I think, asking students to dive into these databases without me doing a demo can be intimidating. But I did try to ensure that they received the same guidance as the other section during that debrief discussion. So that was where I answered questions and made sure to cover any aspects of the databases that students hadn't discovered on their own. And another limitation to note is that a jigsaw is a more time-consuming activity, so that's something to keep in mind if you have limited time. So I'll start by sharing some successes that I observed this semester. In the cognitivist section, I found that most groups engaged well and stayed on task, and most students seemed pretty comfortable navigating the databases, which suggests that the modeling step was useful. Another success is how this approach provides time for the coaching step of the learning process. And I think this is an especially important piece when students are researching niche business topics, and they need guidance on how to triangulate versus trying in vain to find the one perfect source that will address, every aspect of their topic. For example, one group, their project was to create a healthcare employee burnout assessment tool, and they probably weren't going to find a source specifically about that. So when I came over to talk to that group, I coached them on finding sources about employee assessment and about the healthcare industry, and then thinking about how to synthesize those sources to address their topic. And providing this kind of coaching helps students learn how to pivot and keep trying when their initial searches aren't successful. In the constructivist section, I found that some groups engaged with the activity as I envisioned they would. They were independently exploring and discovering. I was more hands-off when making my rounds around the room for this section, and I could hear some good discussion as students figured out searching strategies and shared them with their group members. They were identifying some of the database features and aspects that I would have covered in a demo. For example, students were figuring out how to browse through an IBIS World report and find the chapters that were the most helpful for their topic. They were realizing that their topic combined several industries, and that affected how they needed to search. In a couple of the worksheets, the advice that they would give to their peers was to keep digging, and that there was some awareness that you might need to search more broadly or more narrowly, depending on the database. So they were figuring out through trial and error the scope and coverage of, say, IBIS World versus Mintel. And then the whole class discussion had some good comments and questions from students. In terms of challenges, in both sections, space constraints were a bit of an issue. Like I mentioned, these are classes of 50 to 60 plus students, which means 60 chairs in a classroom with long tables, which somewhat hinders small group discussion and collaboration. and also just makes walking around and talking to everyone more difficult. Time constraints are another factor. I always feel like I could devote more time to searching practice and letting students start to dig into the sources that they find. And then I noticed some groups were more engaged than others, which always happens, but overall there was waning attention and participation throughout the session. So by the time we got to the third database, more students were checked out. In the cognitivist section, there was low participation in the end of class reflection, which was unfortunate because that was supposed to be the final step in their learning process. But because it was at the end, a lot of students just left without completing it. So next time I'll make sure it's not the very last task so that students have to stay and engage with that reflection piece. And then in the constructivist section, I noticed lower engagement than the other section, which suggests I need to make some adjustments to the activities, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I also noticed low participation with completing the worksheet, which I'll also address. So in terms of what's next, I plan to make more adjustments and try this comparison again with more sections in the fall semester. For the cognitivist section, I want to more explicitly model how to deal with failure and dead ends when researching. So I plan to modify my database demos to incorporate example searches that aren't successful and then narrate how I would respond to that. For the constructivist section, I may end up streamlining the jigsaw activity. I observed that most groups skipped over some steps and started talking with each other immediately. And that might be how they prefer to work. And since the peer-to-peer interaction is the important piece for social constructivism, I may revise the instructions to reflect this. And I also might make the goal of the activity more concrete by asking one or two groups to come to the front of the class and share what they learned at the end of the activity. I'm thinking that might incentivize more participation and engagement. I'm also going to offer the worksheet in an online format. I've noticed in other classes that students seem to participate more with online note-taking. And the other benefit to this is if you have it as like a shared Google Doc or a spreadsheet, then you can monitor students' progress in real time and see what they're taking notes on and if there are areas where they're getting stuck. And then I'm also interested in using more tilt or transparency in learning and teaching practices and explaining to students why I am covering certain content or databases and why I'm asking them to engage in an activity. I tried to include some transparency this semester, but I think I can be even more explicit and help students understand the rationale behind the instruction and how it will benefit their learning and success in the course. I'm also considering further cutting down the content and including or covering 2 databases instead of 3. This just comes down to a hard decision between covering more relevant content versus allowing more time for students to engage with exploration and reflection and kind of build those persistence muscles. This would also give me more time for students to dig deeper into evaluating the sources they find and starting to apply them to their assignments, which will also help students see the value of the session.
All right, Madison, you're at the 5-minute mark.
Thank you. It's outside the scope of this presentation, and it's too early to talk about results, but I am conducting a research project on this instruction. So I've had students complete a pre-test and a post-test that measured their skills, knowledge, and attitudes towards researching, so I can compare my pedagogical approaches and see if one is more effective. And so I'll be continuing this data collection in the fall and maybe look out for a future presentation on what I end up finding. And then finally, further down the line, I'm interested in trying out a hybrid lesson plan that combines aspects of both of these approaches. For example, maybe I teach the first database with an I do, you do activity, and then I have students complete a jigsaw with the second database. This could be a way to incorporate some of the benefits of both approaches and provide students multiple ways of learning and engaging. And if you're wondering if one approach is better than the other, my answer is that it depends. As I've demonstrated, I think both of these approaches have their strengths and limitations, and they come with unique considerations for implementation. So you may find one or the other more useful for your students or your own teaching preferences. And I hope the details that I've shared today about my evolving approach to instruction are helpful, and I want to offer a few suggestions for your own instructional experimentation. And then we'll have our brainstorming activity. So first, I suggest using backward design, which is where you start by determining learning outcomes, then consider how to assess, and then finally choose activities or techniques to achieve those outcomes. And for learning outcomes, like I mentioned, you can use the ACRL framework or business competencies, and then return to it and keep those outcomes in mind as you plan. For assessment, I think worksheets can be a great source of data. It gives you a view into what students are noticing and think is important enough to write down, which may be very different from what you think is important about the topic. And this can then become data to inform a future iteration of your lesson plan. And I would also add to the planning process to ask, what do you want to experiment with, or what do you want to learn? Because the session doesn't just have to be a learning experience for your students, but it can also be an opportunity for you to grow as an instructor and increase your pedagogical knowledge. And then when you are planning a change to your instruction, consider the constraints of your own context. So what does the classroom setup look like? How much time do you have? If you want to do a group activity, that might work better if students are already working in groups for the class and they're already developing a group rapport. Also, think critically about what content you absolutely have to cover and what is negotiable and could be removed to allow for more hands-on time for a jigsaw or another activity. And consider if it's possible to move some content to a flipped classroom approach. And then finally, consider the context of your students. So what are their learning preferences and goals? This might depend on your institutional context, but thinking about business students more generally, we know that they can often be practical and outcome-oriented. They want clear steps. So this means they may be more drawn to a cognitivist approach. We also know from the literature that students often rate their information literacy skills fairly high, which I think is sometimes a case of you don't know what you don't know. So it's our job to make sure that we teach the skills and dispositions that students need, whether they are aware that they need those skills or not. And a constructivist approach can encourage students to step out of their comfort zone and stretch their independent searching skills. But it's important to still provide enough guidance so that they feel confident and leave the session understanding the content. And the literature also suggests that students often prefer to work and learn in small groups. So a constructivist approach can lean into that preference by including opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. All right, and with that, I will go ahead. Oops, I don't know why that. Am I sharing the wrong screen again? Well, let me go ahead and switch over because there should be a link in the chat now for our brainstorming activity. And I'll pull that up here, which is a Google Doc that you all can fill out. And so each column has some questions to think about. So you can start by thinking of an instruction session that you want to revise and a new approach or activity that you could experiment with. And then think about what constraints or opportunities might factor into implementing your approach. And then there are columns for thinking about learning outcomes and assessment and any other thoughts. And then I've also included a column for peer feedback because I know there's a lot of collective wisdom here that we can all learn from. So if you have used a similar approach that went well or didn't go so well, and you have advice to share, please do so in that last column. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to work on kind of fill out this activity, and then we can move to the Q&A. I'll just say too, while everyone is kind of thinking and adding, there's a good conversation in the chat about debating kind of online versus paper handouts. One person found that students are unfamiliar with paper handouts. They don't have pens. And so there's some discussion about online, and someone's used Microsoft Forms successfully. Maybe a shared Google Doc or a Google Slides. I like that. I hadn't thought about using slides. Nice. Yeah, I'm seeing in the constraints or opportunities column a lot of comments about timing. Yes, I feel like that is our most common constraint, especially with one shots. Yeah, assessment is hard in a one shot. I think some of the discussion in the chat around different forms for like an online worksheet or online note taking um, can be helpful, especially because students, are filling that out during the activity, and then you can review it as assessment after the fact, so it doesn't like take more time away from the one shot. So I think that can be helpful. Or like an exit ticket, like someone else noted, just a quick sort of ask a few questions at the end of the session just to gauge what students have learned. And then, formative assessment in terms of paying attention to student discussion and what kind of questions come up too. That's also data that can also be assessment. If you find that students are asking questions or you observe that they're having issues with something during the class, that tells you something about what they're learning or not learning. Yeah, like somebody else put like some kind of sharing out. That can be a good form of assessment. It's really interesting to see everyone's different contexts and the different topics and classes that you're teaching for. And the different approaches that you want to try out. So thank you for sharing. So got some comments in the chat in favor of Padlet as a shared note-taking space. Yeah. Okay, I guess at this point I'll leave this the Google Doc open, but if people do have questions or other comments, please feel free to be putting them in the chat and I can get to those. And I did see one question about could I describe the jigsaw activity a little more? Yes, so the point of the jigsaw activity is to have students within a group have some of them do like kind of one activity or look at one database and the others look at something else. And so you start by having them explore individually, and then you have them talk with the people that looked at the same thing. So then they can kind of get on the same page, and maybe some of their peers notice something that they didn't. So there's some peer-to-peer learning happening there. And then you have the students that looked at, you know, database A and the students looked at database B teach each other. So even though, they didn't look at both resources, this is a chance for, again, more peer-to-peer learning to happen. Um, and, it's like if you can teach something, that means you really understand it, right? So it hopefully encourages students to take the exploration seriously because then they're going to be responsible for sharing what they learned to their peers, and vice versa. So that is sort of the thinking behind the jigsaw. I hope that is helpful. Another comment about assessment in the chat that a 1-minute paper has been successful and has gotten the most responses. 1-minute paper on paper, it sounds like. So that's good to know. Yeah, there's also a comment about how the intellectual foundations of some of these learning theories and the framework often don't acknowledge team learning. Yes, I think social constructivism brings that in, but I think cognitivism does assume that you're learning individually, although I think you can build in, team, um, kind of group work or group discussion into that, especially once you get to the scaffolding stage where you're sort of handing it over to the students. I think that can be a good place to introduce more group discussion and team learning. But yeah, that is a good note. More suggestions in the chat. 1-minute papers with the LibWizard form, and somebody else likes Google Docs for group work. Yeah, kind of having like each student group gets a page on the Google Doc to take notes in. And because I think if you did for each individual student, that gets overwhelming. But maybe if you have a page per group, that can be more manageable. All right. Well, I guess if there's one more comment in the chat. Oh, nice. I like that. So someone uses a survey at the end of class and their pitch is something like a good business person wants feedback on their product. So I want feedback on this workshop. I like that a lot. Thank you all so much for sharing your ideas and what works well for you and everything in the chat. Oh, recent concerns on Padlet using information to train AI. Did not know that. Thank you for sharing that.
Right. Are there any other questions for Madison? Don't see anything coming in. So thank you so much, Madison, for sharing with us. I was taking some notes and I have some ideas from some actually, sorry, there was another question that did just come in. Did you get feedback from faculty on these classes? Sorry.
Uh, um, yeah, so when I taught with the kind of original or the existing lesson plan in the fall, I mean, I got good feedback, mostly about like the content that I covered. Faculty felt like it was really relevant for students. And when I let them know that I was planning to do this comparison in the spring, I think they thought it sounded interesting. I didn't really get any feedback that they liked one approach more than the other. But again, just that, you know, they see the value, in the coverage and the in what is covered and how it ties back into student assignments. And then I also saw there was a question about experimenting with any other approaches. Um, I don't know about any other approaches than these, besides maybe like the hybrid approach eventually. My next step might be to um, try this comparison or try one of these approaches in some of my other one-shots. I've been sort of taking it one course at a time, but I think that I could do a similar sort of because I teach a lot of courses or a lot of one-shots for different sections of the same course in a 200 level course. So I could definitely have opportunity to do a sort of similar comparison and see what seems to work better in that context.
All right. Then I see just some more comments about other types of strategies people are taking, but I think that was the last question, unless we have one more minute. Well, thank you so much, Madison. That was really helpful. And again, I think obviously lots of great conversation in the chat, lots of things for folks to think about. Doris, if you could go ahead and stop the recording, please.